Chapter 13 of 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Marlow is one of the pleasantest river centres I know of. It is a bustling, lively little town. Not very picturesque on the whole, it is true, but there are many quaint nooks and corners to be found in it nevertheless. Standing arches in the shattered bridge of time, over which our fancy travels back to the days when Marlow Manor owned Saxon Algar for its lord, ere conquering William seized it to give to Queen Matilda, ere it passed to the Earls of Warwick, or to worldly-wide Lord Paget, the counsellor of 4 successive sovereigns. There is lovely country round about it, too, if after boating you are fond of a walk, while the river itself is at its best here. Down to Cookham, past the quarry woods and the meadows, is a lovely reach. Dear old quarry woods, with your narrow climbing paths and little winding glades. How scented to this hour you seem with memories of sunny summer days. How haunted are your shadowy vistas with the ghosts of laughing faces. How from your whispering leaves there softly fall the voices of long ago. From Marlow up to Sonning is even fairer yet. Grand old Bisham Abbey, whose stone walls have rung to the shouts of the Knights Templars, and which at one time was the home of Anne of Cleves, and at another of Queen Elizabeth, is passed on the right bank just half a mile above Marlow Bridge. Bisham Abbey is rich in melodramatic properties. It contains a tapestried bedchamber and a secret room hid high up in the thick walls. The ghost of the Lady Holy, who beat a little boy to death, still walks there at night, trying to wash its ghostly hands clean in a ghostly basin. Warwick, the kingmaker, rests there, careless now about such trivial things as earthly kings and earthly kingdoms, and Salisbury, who did good service at Poitiers. Just before you come to the abbey, and right on the river's bank, is Bisham Church, and perhaps if any tombs are worth inspecting, they are the tombs and monuments in Bisham Church. It was while floating in his boat under the Bisham beeches that Shelley, who was then living at Marlow, you can see his house now in West Street, composed The Revolt of Islam. By Hurley Weir, a little higher up, I have often thought that I could stay a month without having sufficient time to drink in all the beauty of the scene. The village of Hurley, 5 minutes' walk from the loch, is as old a little spot as there is on the river, dating as it does, to quote the quaint phraseology of those dim days, from the times of King Sebert and King Offa. Just past the weir, going up, is Danes Field, where the invading Danes once encamped during their march to Gloucestershire, and a little further still, nestling by a sweet corner of the stream, is what is left of Medmenham Abbey. The famous Medmenham monks, or Hellfire Club as they were commonly called, and of whom the notorious Wilkes was a member, were a fraternity whose motto was "Do as you please," and that invitation still stands over the ruined doorway of the abbey. Many years before this bogus abbey, with its congregation of irreverent jesters, was founded, there stood upon this same spot a monastery of a sterner kind, whose monks were of a somewhat different type to the revellers that were to follow them 500 years afterwards. The Cistercian monks, whose abbey stood there in the 13th century, wore no clothes but rough tunics and cowls, and ate no flesh, nor fish, nor eggs. They lay upon straw, and they rose at midnight to mass. They spent the day in labour, reading and prayer, and over all their lives there fell a silence as of death, for no one spoke. A grim fraternity, passing grim lives in that sweet spot that God had made so bright. Strange that nature's voices all around them, the soft singing of the waters, the whisperings of the river grass, the music of the rushing wind, should not have taught them a truer meaning of life than this. They listened there, through the long days, in silence, waiting for a voice from heaven, and all day long and through the solemn night it spoke to them in myriad tones, and they heard it not. From Medmenham to sweet Hambledon Loch, the river is full of peaceful beauty, but after it passes Greenlands, the rather uninteresting-looking river residence of my newsagent, a quiet, unassuming old gentleman, who may often be met with about these regions during the summer months, sculling himself along in easy, vigorous style, or chatting genially to some old lock-keeper as he passes through, until well the other side of Henley, it is somewhat bare and dull. We got up tolerably early on the Monday morning at Marlow, and went for a bathe before breakfast, and coming back, Montmorency made an awful ass of himself. The only subject on which Montmorency and I have any serious difference of opinion is cats. I like cats. Montmorency does not. When I meet a cat, I say, "Poor pussy," and stop down and tickle the side of its head, and the cat sticks up its tail in a rigid cast-iron manner, arches its back, and wipes its nose up against my trousers, and all is gentleness and peace. When Montmorency meets a cat, the whole street knows about it, and there is enough bad language wasted in 10 seconds to last an ordinarily respectable man all his life, with care. I do not blame the dog, contenting myself as a rule with merely clouting his head or throwing stones at him, because I take it that it is his nature. Fox terriers are born with about 4 times as much original sin in them as other dogs are, and it will take years and years of patient effort on the part of us Christians to bring about any appreciable reformation in the rowdiness of the fox terrier nature. I remember being in the lobby of the Haymarket stores one day, and all around me were dogs, waiting for the return of their owners, who were shopping inside. There were a Mastiff and 1 or 2 collies and a St. Bernard, a few Retrievers and Newfoundlands, a Boarhound, a French Poodle, with plenty of hair round its head, but mangy around the middle, a Bulldog, a few Lowther Arcade sorts of animals, about the size of rats, and a couple of Yorkshire Tykes. There they sat, patient, good, and thoughtful. A solemn peacefulness seemed to reign in that lobby. An air of calmness and resignation, of gentle sadness pervaded the room. Then a sweet young lady entered, leading a meek-looking little fox terrier, and left him, chained up there, between the bulldog and the poodle. He sat and looked about him for a minute. Then he cast his eyes up to the ceiling, and seemed, judging from his expression, to be thinking of his mother. Then he yawned. Then he looked round at the other dogs, all silent, grave, and dignified. He looked at the bulldog, sleeping dreamlessly on his right. He looked at the poodle, erect and haughty, on his left. Then, without a word of warning, without the shadow of a provocation, he bit the poodle's near foreleg, and a yelp of agony ran through the quiet shades of that lobby. The result of his first experiment seemed highly satisfactory to him, and he determined to go on and make things lively all round. He sprang over the poodle and vigorously attacked a collie, and the collie woke up and immediately commenced a fierce and noisy contest with the poodle. Then Foxy came back to his own place, and caught the bulldog by the ear, and tried to throw him away. And the bulldog, a curiously impartial animal, went for everything he could reach, including the hall porter, which gave that little terrier the opportunity to enjoy an uninterrupted fight of his own with an equally willing Yorkshire Tyke. Anyone who knows canine nature need hardly be told that by this time all the other dogs in the place were fighting as if their hearths and homes depended on the fray. The big dogs fought each other indiscriminately, and the little dogs fought among themselves, and filled up their spare time by biting the legs of the big dogs. The whole lobby was a perfect pandemonium, and the din was terrific. A crowd assembled in the Haymarket, and asked if it was a vestry meeting, or if not, who was being murdered and why. Men came with poles and ropes and tried to separate the dogs, and the police were sent for. And in the midst of the riot, that sweet young lady returned, and snatched up that sweet little dog of hers — he had laid the Tyke up for a month, and had on the expression now of a newborn lamb — into her arms, and kissed him, and asked him if he was killed, and what those great nasty brutes of dogs had been doing to him, and he nestled up against her, and gazed up into her face with a look that seemed to say, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come to take me away from this disgraceful scene." She said that the people at the stores had no right to allow great savage things like those other dogs to be put with respectable people's dogs, and that she had a great mind to summon somebody. Such is the nature of fox terriers, and therefore I do not blame Montmorency for his tendency to row with cats, but he wished he had not given way to it that morning. We were, as I have said, returning from a dip, and halfway up the High Street a cat darted out from one of the houses in front of us, and began to trot across the road. Montmorency gave a cry of joy, the cry of a stern warrior who sees his enemy given over to his hands, the sort of cry Cromwell might have offered when the Scots came down the hill, and flew after his prey. His victim was a large black Tom. I never saw a larger cat, nor a more disreputable-looking cat. It had lost half its tail, one of its ears, and a fairly appreciable proportion of its nose. It was a long, sinewy-looking animal. It had a calm, contented air about it. Montmorency went for that poor cat at the rate of 20 miles an hour, but the cat did not hurry up, did not seem to have grasped the idea that its life was in danger. It trotted quietly on until its would-be assassin was within a yard of it, and then it turned round and sat down in the middle of the road and looked at Montmorency with a gentle, inquiring expression that said, "Yes? You want me?" Montmorency does not lack pluck, but there was something about the look of that cat that might have chilled the heart of the boldest dog. He stopped abruptly and looked at Tom. Neither spoke, but the conversation that one can imagine was clearly as follows. The cat: "Can I do anything for you?" Montmorency: No, thanks." The cat: "Don't you mind speaking, if you really want anything, you know." Montmorency, backing down the high street: "Oh, no, not at all. Certainly, don't you trouble. I am afraid I made a mistake. I thought I knew you. Sorry I disturbed you." The cat: "Not at all. Quite a pleasure. Sure you don't want anything now?" Montmorency, still backing: "No, not at all. Thanks, not at all. Very kind of you. Good morning." The cat: "Good morning." Then the cat rose and continued his trot, and Montmorency, fitting what he calls his tail carefully into its groove, came back to us and took up an unimportant position in the rear. To this day, if you say the word cats to Montmorency, he will visibly shrink and look up piteously as if to say, "Please don't." We did our marketing after breakfast and re-victualled the boat for 3 days. George said we ought to take vegetables, that it was unhealthy not to eat vegetables. He said they were easier enough to cook, and that he would see to that, so we got 10 pounds of potatoes, a bushel of peas, and a few cabbages. We got a beefsteak pie, a couple of gooseberry tarts, and a leg of mutton from the hotel, and fruit and cakes and bread and butter and jam and bacon and eggs, and other things we foraged round about the town for. Our departure from Marlow I regard as one of our greatest successes. It was dignified and impressive, without being ostentatious. We had insisted at all the shops we had been to that the things should be sent with us then and there. None of your "Yes, sir, I will send them off at once, the boy will be down there before you are, sir," and then fooling about on the landing stage, and going back to the shop twice to have a row about them, for us. We waited while the basket was packed, and took the boy with us. We went to a good many shops, adopting this principle at each one, and the consequence was that by the time we had finished, we had as fine a collection of boys with baskets following us around as heart could desire, and our final march down the middle of the High Street to the river must have been as imposing a spectacle as Marlow had seen for many a long day. The order of the procession was as follows: Montmorency carrying a stick, 2 disreputable-looking curs, friends of Montmorency's, George carrying coats and rugs and smoking a short pipe, Harris trying to walk with easy grace while carrying a bulged-out Gladstone bag in one hand and a bottle of lime juice in the other, greengrocer's boy and baker's boy with baskets, Boots from the hotel carrying hamper, confectioner's boy with basket, grocer's boy with basket, long-haired dog, cheesemonger's boy with a basket, odd man carrying a bag, bosom companion of odd man with his hands in his pockets, smoking a short clay, fruiterer's boy with basket, myself carrying 3 hats and a pair of boots and trying to look as if I didn't know it, 6 small boys and 4 stray dogs. When we got down to the landing stage, the boatman said, "Let me see, sir, was yours a steam launch or a houseboat?" On our informing him it was a double-sculling skiff, he seemed surprised. We had a good deal of trouble with steam launches that morning. It was just before the Henley week, and they were going up in large numbers, some by themselves, some towing houseboats. I do hate steam launches. I suppose every rowing man does. I never see a steam launch, but I feel I should like to lure it to a lonely part of the river, and there, in the silence and the solitude, strangle it. There is a blatant bumptiousness about a steam launch that has the knack of rousing every evil instinct in my nature, and I yearn for the good old days when you could go about and tell people what you thought of them with a hatchet and a bow and arrows. The expression on the face of the man who, with his hands in his pockets, stands by the stern smoking a cigar is sufficient to excuse a breach of the peace by itself, and the lordly whistle for you to get out of the way would, I am confident, ensure a verdict of justifiable homicide from any jury of rivermen. They used to have to whistle for us to get out of their way. If I may do so without appearing boastful, I think I can honestly say that our one small boat, during that week, caused more annoyance and delay and aggravation to the steam launches that we came across than all the other craft on the river put together. "Steam launch coming," one of us would cry out, on sighting the enemy in the distance, and in an instant everything was got ready to receive her. I would take the lines, and Harris and George would sit down beside me, all of us with our backs to the launch, and the boat would drift out quietly into mid-stream. On would come the launch, whistling, and on we would go, drifting. At about 100 yards off, she would start whistling like mad, and the people would come and lean over the side and roar at us, but we never heard them. Harris would be telling us an anecdote about his mother, and George and I would not have missed a word of it for worlds. Then that launch would give one final shriek of a whistle that would nearly burst the boiler, and she would reverse her engines and blow off steam and swing round and get aground. Everybody on board of it would rush to the bow and yell at us, and the people on the bank would stand and shout to us, and all the other passing boats would stop and join in, till the whole river, from miles up and down, was in a state of frantic commotion. And then Harris would break off in the most interesting part of his narrative, and look up with mild surprise and say to George, "Why, George, bless me, if here isn't a steam launch!" And George would answer, "Well, do you know, I thought I heard something," upon which he would get nervous and confused, and not know how to get the boat out of the way, and the people in the launch would crowd round and instruct us. "Pull your right, you idiot, back with your left, no, not you, the other one, leave the lines alone, can't you, now, both together, not that way, oh, you." Then they would lower a boat, and come to our assistance, and after a quarter of an hour's efforts would get us clean out of their way, so that they could go on, and we would thank them so much, and ask them to give us a tow, but they never would. Another good way we discovered of irritating the aristocratic type of steam launch was to mistake them for a bean feast, and ask them if they were Messrs. Cubit's lot or the Bermondsey Good Templars, and could they lend us a saucepan. Old ladies, not accustomed to the river, are always intensely nervous of steam launches. I remember going up once from Staines to Windsor, a stretch of water particularly rich in these mechanical monstrosities, with a party containing 3 ladies of this description. It was very exciting. At the first glimpse of every steam launch that came in view, they insisted on landing and sitting down on the bank until it was out of sight again. They said they were very sorry, but that they owed it to their families not to be foolhardy. We found ourselves short of water at Hambledon Lock, so we took our jar and went up to the lock-keeper's house to beg for some. George was our spokesman. He put on a winning smile and said, "Oh, please, could you spare us a little water?" "Certainly," replied the old gentleman. "Take as much as you want and leave the rest." "Thank you so much," murmured George, looking about him. Where do you keep it?" "It's always in the same place, my boy," was the stolid reply. "Just behind you." "I don't see it," said George, turning round. "Why, bless you, where's your eyes?" was the man's comment, as he twisted George round and pointed up and down the stream. "There's enough of it to see it there." "Oh," exclaimed George, grasping the idea, "but we can't drink the river, you know." "No, but you can drink some of it," replied the old fellow. "It's what I've drunk for the last 15 years. George told him that his appearance, after the course, did not seem a sufficiently good advertisement for the brand, and that he would prefer it out of a pump. We got some from a cottage a little higher up. I dare say that was only river water, if we had known, but we did not know, so it was all right. What the eye does not see, the stomach does not get upset over. We tried river water once, later on in the season, but it was not a success. We were coming downstream, and had pulled up to have tea in a backwater near Windsor. Our jar was empty, and it was a case of going without our tea or taking water from the river. Harris was for chancing it. He said it must be all right if we boiled the water. He said that the various germs of poison present in the water would be killed by the boiling. So we filled our kettle with Thames backwater, and boiled it, and very careful we were to see that it did boil. We had made the tea, and were just settling down comfortably to drink it, when George, with his cup halfway to his lip, paused and exclaimed, "What's that?" "What's what?" asked Harris and I. "Why, that," said George, looking westward. Harris and I followed his gaze, and saw, coming down towards us on the sluggish current, a dog. It was one of the quietest and peacefulest dogs I have ever seen. I never met a dog who seemed more contented, more easy in its mind. It was floating dreamily on its back, with its 4 legs stuck up straight into the air. It was what I should call a full-bodied dog, with a well-developed chest. On he came, serene, dignified, and calm, until he was abreast of our boat, and there among the rushes he eased up and settled down cosily for the evening. George said he didn't want any tea, and emptied his cup into the water. Harris didn't feel thirsty either, and followed suit. I had drunk half mine, but I wished I had not. I asked George if he thought I was likely to have typhoid. He said, "Oh no." He thought I had a very good chance indeed of escaping it. Anyhow, I should know in about a fortnight whether I had or had not. We went up the backwater to Wargrave. It is a short cut, leading out of the right-hand bank about half a mile above Marsh Lock, and is well worth taking, being a pretty, shady little piece of stream, besides saving nearly half a mile of distance. Of course, its entrance is studded with posts and chains, and surrounded by notice boards, menacing all kinds of torture, imprisonment, and death to everyone who dares set skull upon its waters. I wonder some of these riparian boors don't claim the air of the river and threaten everyone with 40 shillings fine who breathes it. But the posts and chains a little skill will easily avoid, and as for the boards, you might, if you have 5 minutes to spare, and there is nobody about, take 1 or 2 of them down and throw them into the river. Halfway up the backwater, we got out and lunched, and it was during this lunch that George and I received rather a trying shock. Harris received a shock too, but I do not think Harris's shock could have been anything like so bad as the shock that George and I had over the business. You see, it was in this way. We were sitting in a meadow about 10 yards from the water's edge, and we had just settled down comfortably to feed. Harris had the beefsteak pie between his knees, and was carving it, and George and I were waiting with our plates ready. "Have you got a spoon there?" says Harris. "I want a spoon to help the gravy with." The hamper was close behind us, and George and I both turned round to reach one out. We were not 5 seconds getting it. When we looked round again, Harris and the pie were gone. It was a wide, open field. There was not a tree or a bit of hedge for hundreds of yards. He could not have tumbled into the river, because we were on the water side of him, and he would have had to climb over us to do it. George and I gazed all about. Then we gazed at each other. "Has he been snatched up to heaven?" I queried. "They'd hardly have taken the pie too," said George. There seemed weight in this objection, and we discarded the heavenly theory. "I suppose the truth of the matter is," suggested George, descending to the commonplace and practicable, "that there has been an earthquake." And then he added, with a touch of sadness in his voice, "I wish he hadn't been carving that pie." With a sigh, we turned our eyes once more towards the spot where Harris and the pie had last been seen on earth, and there, as our blood froze in our veins and our hair stood up on end, we saw Harris's head, and nothing but his head, sticking bolt upright among the tall grass, his face very red and bearing upon it an expression of great indignation. George was the first to recover. "Speak," he cried, "and tell us whether you are alive or dead, and where is the rest of you?" "Oh, don't be a stupid ass," said Harris's head. "I believe you did it on purpose." "Did what?" exclaimed George and I. "Why, put me to sit here. Darn silly trick. Here, catch hold of the pie." And out of the middle of the earth, as it seemed to us, rose the pie, very much mixed up and damaged, and after it scrambled Harris, tumbled, grubby, and wet. He had been sitting, without knowing it, on the very verge of a small gully, the long grass hiding it from view, and in leaning a little back he had shot over, pie and all. He said he had never felt so surprised in all his life as when he first felt himself going, without being able to conjecture in the slightest what had happened. He thought at first that the end of the world had come. Harris believes to this day that George and I planned it all beforehand. Thus does unjust suspicion follow even the most blameless, for, as the poet says, who shall escape calumny? Who indeed? End of chapter 13. Recording by Adrian Wheel. Chapter 14 of 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. We caught a breeze after lunch which took us gently up past Wargrave and Shiplake. Mellowed in the drowsy sunlight of a summer's afternoon, Wargrave, nestling where the river bends, makes a sweet old picture as you pass it, and one that lingers long upon the retina of memory. The George and Dragon at Wargrave boasts a sign painted on the one side by Leslie, R.A., and on the other by Hodgson of that ilk. Leslie has depicted the fight, Hodgson has imagined the scene after the fight, George, the work done, enjoying his pint of beer. Day, the author of Sandford and Merton, lived and, more credit to the place still, was killed at Wargrave. In the church is a memorial to Mrs. Sarah Hill, who bequeathed £1 annually to be divided at Easter between 2 boys and 2 girls who have never been undutiful to their parents, who have never been known to swear or to tell untruths, to steal or to break windows. Fancy giving all that up for 5 shillings a year. It's not worth it. It is rumoured in the town that once, many years ago, a boy appeared who really never had done these things, or at all events, which was all that was required or could be expected, had never been known to do them, and thus won the crown of glory. He was exhibited for 3 weeks afterwards in the town hall, under a glass case. What has become of the money since, no one knows. They say it is always handed over to the nearest waxworks show. Shiplake is a pretty village, but it cannot be seen from the river, being upon the hill. Tennyson was married in Shiplake Church. The river up to Sonning winds in and out through many islands, and is very placid, hushed and lonely. Few folk, except at twilight, a pair or 2 of rustic lovers, walk along its banks. Harry and Lord Fitznoodle have been left behind at Henley, and dismal, dirty Reading is not yet reached. It is a part of the river in which to dream of bygone days, and vanished forms and faces, and things that might have been, but are not. Confound them. We got out at Sonning, and went for a walk round the village. It is the most fairy-like little nook on the whole river. It is more like a stage village than one built of bricks and mortar. Every house is smothered in roses, and now, in early June, they were bursting forth in clouds of dainty splendour. If you stop at Sonning, put up at the Bull, behind the church. It is a veritable picture of an old country inn, with green, square courtyard in front, where, on seats beneath the trees, the old men group of an evening to drink their ale and gossip over village politics, with low, quaint rooms and lattice windows, and awkward stairs and winding passages. We roamed about Sweet Sonning for an hour or so, and then, it being too late to push on past Reading, we decided to go back to one of the Shiplake Islands and put up there for the night. It was still early when we got settled, and George said that, as we had plenty of time, it would be a splendid opportunity to try a good slap-up supper. He said he would show us what could be done up the river in the way of cooking, and suggested that, with the vegetables and the remains of the cold beef and general odds and ends, we should make an Irish stew. It seemed a fascinating idea. George gathered wood and made a fire, and Harris and I started to peel the potatoes. I should never have thought that peeling potatoes was such an undertaking. The job turned out to be the biggest thing of its kind that I have ever been in. We began cheerfully, one might almost say skittishly, but our light-heartedness was gone by the time the first potato was finished. The more we peeled, the more peel there seemed to be left on. By the time we'd got all the peel off and all the eyes out, there was no potato left, at least none worth speaking of. George came and had a look at it. It was about the size of a peanut. He said, "Oh, that won't do, you're wasting them. You must scrape them." So we scraped them, and that was harder work than peeling. They're such an extraordinary shape, potatoes, all bumps and warts and hollows. We worked steadily for 25 minutes, and did 4 potatoes. Then we struck. We said we should require the rest of the evening for scraping ourselves. I never saw such a thing as potato scraping for making a fellow in a mess. It seemed difficult to believe that the potato scrapings, in which Harris and I stood, half smothered, could have come off 4 potatoes. It shows you what can be done with economy and care. George said it was absurd to have only 4 potatoes in an Irish stew, so we washed half a dozen or so more and put them in without peeling. We also put in a cabbage and about half a peck of peas. George stirred it all up, and then he said there seemed to be a lot of room to spare. So we overhauled both the hampers and picked out all the odds and ends and the remnants and added them to the stew. There were half a pork pie and a bit of cold boiled bacon left, and we put them in. Then George found half a tin of potted salmon, and he emptied that into the pot. He said that was the advantage of Irish stew, you got rid of such a lot of things. I fished out a couple of eggs that had got cracked and put those in. George said they would thicken the gravy. I forget the other ingredients, but I know nothing was wasted, and I remember that towards the end, Montmorency, who had evinced great interest in the proceedings throughout, strolled away with an earnest and thoughtful air, reappearing a few minutes afterwards with a dead water rat in his mouth, which he evidently wished to present as his contribution to the dinner. Whether in a sarcastic spirit, or with a genuine desire to assist, I cannot say. We had a discussion as to whether the rat should go in or not. Harris said he thought it would be all right, mixed up with the other things, and that every little helped. But George stood up for precedent. He said he had never heard of water rats in Irish stew, and he would rather be on the safe side and not try experiments. Harris says, "If you never try a new thing, how can you tell what it's like? It's men such as you that hamper the world's progress. Think of the man who first tried German sausage." It was a great success, that Irish stew. I don't think I ever enjoyed a meal more. There was something so fresh and piquant about it. One's palate gets so tired of the old hackneyed things. Here was a dish with a new flavour, with a taste like nothing else on earth. And it was nourishing too. As George said, there was good stuff in it. The peas and potatoes might have been a bit softer, but we all had good teeth, so that did not matter much, and as for the gravy, it was a poem. A little too rich perhaps for a weak stomach, but nutritious. We finished up with tea and cherry tart. Montmorency had a fight with a kettle during tea time and came off a poor second. Throughout the trip he had manifested great curiosity concerning the kettle. He would sit and watch it as it boiled, with a puzzled expression, and would try and rouse it every now and then by growling at it. When it began to splutter and steam, he regarded this as a challenge and would want to fight it, only at that precise moment someone would always dash up and bear off his prey before he could get at it. Today, he determined, he would be beforehand. At the first sound the kettle made, he rose, growling, and advanced towards it in a threatening attitude. It was only a little kettle, but it was full of pluck, and it up and spit at him. "Oh, would you?" growled Montmorency, showing his teeth. "I'll teach you to cheek a hard-working, respectable dog, you miserable, long-nosed, dirty-looking scoundrel, you! Come on!" And he rushed at that poor little kettle, and seized it by the spout. Then, across the evening stillness, broke a blood-curdling yelp, and Montmorency left the boat and did a constitutional 3 times round the island at the rate of 35 miles an hour, stopping every now and then to bury his nose in a bit of cool mud. From that day, Montmorency regarded the kettle with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and hate. Whenever he saw it, he would growl and back at a rapid rate, with his tail shut down, and the moment it was put upon the stove, he would promptly climb out of the boat and sit on the bank till the whole tea business was over. George got out his banjo after supper and wanted to play it, but Harris objected. He said he had got a headache and did not feel strong enough to stand it. George thought the music might do him good, said music often soothed the nerves and took away a headache, and he twanged 2 or 3 notes just to show Harris what it was like. Harris said he'd rather have the headache. George has never learned to play the banjo to this day. He has had too much all-round discouragement to meet. He tried on 2 or 3 evenings, while we were up the river, to get a little practice, but it was never a success. Harris's language used to be enough to unnerve any man, added to which Montmorency would sit and howl steadily right through the performance. It was not giving the man a fair chance. "What's he want to howl like that for when I'm playing?" George would exclaim indignantly, while taking aim at him with a boot. "What do you want to play like that for when he is howling?" Harris would retort, catching the boot. "You let him alone. He can't help howling. He's got a musical ear, and your playing makes him howl." So George determined to postpone study of the banjo until he reached home, but he did not get much opportunity even there. Mrs. P used to come up and say she was very sorry. For herself she liked to hear him, but the lady upstairs was in a very delicate state, and the doctor was afraid it might injure the child. Then George tried taking it out with him late at night and practising round the square, but the inhabitants complained to the police about it, and a watch was set for him one night, and he was captured. The evidence against him was very clear, and he was bound over to keep the peace for 6 months. He seemed to lose heart in the business after that. He did make 1 or 2 feeble efforts to take up the work again when the 6 months had elapsed, but there was always the same coldness, the same want of sympathy on the part of the world to fight against, and after a while he despaired altogether, and advertised the instrument for sale at a great sacrifice, owner having no further use for same, and took to learning card tricks instead. It must be disheartening work learning a musical instrument. You would think that society, for its own sake, would do all it could to assist a man to acquire the art of playing a musical instrument, but it doesn't. I knew a young fellow once who was studying to play the bagpipes, and you'd be surprised at the amount of opposition he had to contend with. Why, Not even from the members of his own family did he receive what you would call active encouragement. His father was dead against the business from the beginning, and spoke quite unfeelingly on the subject. My friend used to get up early in the morning to practice, but he had to give that plan up because of his sister. She was somewhat religiously inclined, and she said it seemed such an awful thing to begin the day like that. So he sat up at night instead and played after the family had gone to bed, but that did not do, as it got the house such a bad name. People going home late would stop outside to listen, and then put it about all over the town the next morning that a fearful murder had been committed at Mr. Jefferson's the night before, and would describe how they'd heard the victim's shrieks and the brutal oaths and curses of the murderer, followed by the prayer for mercy and the last dying gurgle of the corpse. So they let him practice in the daytime, in the back kitchen with all the doors shut. But his more successful passages could generally be heard in the sitting room, in spite of these precautions, and would affect his mother almost to tears. She said it put her in mind of her poor father. He had been swallowed by a shark, poor man, while bathing off the coast of New Guinea. Where the connection came in, she could not explain. Then they knocked up a little place for him at the bottom of the garden, about a quarter of a mile from the house, and made him take the machine down there when he wanted to work it. And sometimes a visitor would come to the house who knew nothing of the matter, and they would forget to tell him all about it and caution him, and he would go out for a stroll round the garden and suddenly get within earshot of those bagpipes without being prepared for it or knowing what it was. If he were a man of strong mind, it only gave him fits, but a person of mere average intellect it usually sent mad. There is, it must be confessed, something very sad about the early efforts of an amateur in bagpipes. I have felt that myself when listening to my young friend. They appear to be a trying instrument to perform upon. You have to get enough breath for the whole tune before you start. At least, so I gathered from watching Jefferson. He would begin magnificently with a wild, full, come-to-the-battle sort of note that quite roused you. But he would get more and more piano as he went on, and the last verse generally collapsed in the middle with a splutter and a hiss. You want to be in good health to play the bagpipes. Young Jefferson only learnt to play one tune on those bagpipes, but I never heard any complaints about the insufficiency of his repertoire, none whatever. The tune was "The Campbells are Coming, hooray, hooray," so he said, though his father always held that it was the Bluebells of Scotland. Nobody seemed quite sure what it was exactly, but they all agreed that it sounded Scotch. Strangers were allowed 3 guesses, and most of them guessed a different tune each time. Harris was disagreeable after supper. I think it must have been the stew that had upset him. He is not used to high living. So George and I left him in the boat and settled to go for a mooch round Henley. He said he should have a glass of whisky and a pipe and fix things up for the night. We were to shout when we returned, and he would row over from the island and fetch us. "Don't go to sleep, old man," we said as we started. "Not much fear of this while this stew's on," he grunted as he pulled back to the island. Henley was getting ready for the regatta, and was full of bustle. We met a goodish number of men we knew about the town, and in their pleasant company the time slipped by somewhat quickly. So it was nearly 11 o'clock before we set off on our 4-mile walk home, as we had learned to call our little craft by this time. It was a dismal night, coldish, with a thin rain falling, and as we trudged through the dark, silent fields, talking low to each other, and wondering if we were going right or not, we thought of the cosy boat, with the bright light streaming through the tight-drawn canvas, of Harris and Montmorency, and the whisky, and wished that we were there. We conjured up the picture of ourselves inside, tired and a little hungry, of the gloomy river and the shapeless trees, and, like a giant glowworm underneath them, our dear old boat, so snug and warm and cheerful. We could see ourselves at supper there, pecking away at cold meat, and passing each other chunks of bread. We could hear the cheery clatter of our knives, the laughing voices filling all the space and overflowing through the opening out into the night. And we hurried on to realise the vision. We struck the towpath at length, and that made us happy, because prior to this we had not been sure whether we were walking towards the river or away from it, and when you are tired and want to go to bed, uncertainties like that worry you. We passed Skiplake as the clock was striking the 11:45, and then George said, thoughtfully, "You don't happen to remember which of the islands it was, do you?" "No," I replied, beginning to grow thoughtful too. "I don't. How many are there?" "Only 4," answered George. "It will be all right if he's awake." "And if not?" I queried, but we dismissed that train of thought. We shouted when we came opposite the first island, but there was no response, so we went to the second and tried there and obtained the same result. "Oh, I remember now," said George. "It was the third one." And we ran on hopefully to the third one, and hallooed. No answer. The case was becoming serious. It was now past midnight. The hotels at Skiplake and Henley would be crammed, and we could not go round knocking up cottagers and householders in the middle of the night to know if they let apartments. George suggested walking back to Henley and assaulting a policeman, and so getting a night's lodging in the station house. But then there was the thought, suppose he only hits us back and refuses to lock us up? We could not pass the whole night fighting policemen. Besides, we didn't want to overdo the thing and get 6 months. We despairingly tried what seemed in the darkness to be the fourth island, but met with no better success. The rain was coming down fast now, and evidently meant to last. We were wet to the skin, and cold, and miserable. We began to wonder whether there were only 4 islands, or more, or whether we were near the islands at all, or whether we were anywhere within a mile of where we ought to be, or in the wrong part of the river altogether. Everything looked so strange and different in the darkness. We began to understand the sufferings of the babes in the wood. Just when we had given up all hope, yes, I know that is always the time that things do happen in novels and tales, but I can't help it. I resolved when I began to write this book that I would be strictly truthful in all things, and so I will be, even if I have to employ hackneyed phrases for the purpose. It was just when we had given up all hope, and I must therefore say so, just when we had given up all hope, then I suddenly caught sight, a little way below us, of a strange, weird sort of glimmer flickering among the trees on the opposite bank. For an instant I thought of ghosts. It was such a shadowy, mysterious light. The next moment it flashed across me that it was our boat, and I sent up such a yell across the water that made the night seem to shake in its bed. We waited breathless for a minute, and then, oh, divinest music of the darkness, we heard the answering bark of Montmorency. We shouted back loud enough to wake the 7 sleepers. I never could understand myself why it should take more noise to wake 7 sleepers than 1, and after what seemed an hour, but what was really, I suppose, about 5 minutes, we saw the lighted boat creeping slowly over the blackness, and heard Harris's sleepy voice asking where we were. There was an unaccountable strangeness about Harris. It was something more than mere ordinary tiredness. He pulled the boat against a part of the bank from which it was quite impossible for us to get into it, and immediately went to sleep. It took us an immense amount of screaming and roaring to wake him up again and put some sense into him, but we succeeded at last, and got safely on board. Harris had a sad expression on him, so we noticed, when we got into the boat. He gave you the idea of a man who had been through trouble. We asked him if anything had happened, and he said, "Swans." It seemed we had moored close to a swan's nest, and soon after George and I had gone, the female swan came back and kicked up a row about it. Harris had chivied her off, and she had gone away, and fetched up her old man. Harris said he had had quite a fight with these 2 swans, but courage and skill had prevailed in the end, and he had defeated them. Half an hour afterwards they returned with 18 other swans. It must have been a fearful battle, so far as we could understand Harris's account of it. The swans had tried to drag him and Montmorency out of the boat and drown them, and he had defended himself like a hero for 4 hours, and had killed the lot, and they had all paddled away to die. "How many swans did you say there were?" asked George. 32, replied Harris sleepily. "You said 18 just now." "No, I didn't," grunted Harris. "I said 12. Think I can't count." What were the real facts about these swans we never found out. We questioned Harris on the subject in the morning, and he said, "What swans?" and seemed to think that George and I had been dreaming. Oh, how delightful it was to be safe in the boat after our trials and fears. We ate a hearty supper, George and I, and we should have had some toddy after it if we could have found the whisky, but we could not. We examined Harris as to what he had done with it, but he did not seem to know what we meant by whisky, or what we were talking about at all. Montmorency looked as though he knew something, but said nothing. I slept well that night, and should have slept better if it had not been for Harris. I have a vague recollection of having been woke up at least a dozen times during the night by Harris wandering about the boat with a lantern, looking for his clothes. He seemed to be worrying about his clothes all night. Twice he roused up George and myself to see if we were lying on his trousers. George got quite wild the second time. "What the thunder do you want your trousers for, in the middle of the night?" he asked indignantly. "Why don't you lie down and go to sleep?" I found him in trouble the next time I awoke, because he could not find his socks, and my last hazy remembrance is of being rolled over on my side, and of hearing Harris muttering something about its being an extraordinary thing where his umbrella could have got to. End of chapter 14. Recording by Adrian Wheel.